basic method to get at the truth. And operation science would include experimental physics, experimental biology, chemistry, medical research, engineering research. And this is the science that gives us our technology. It gives us cures to disease. It gives us the space shuttle, cell phones, computers. And it uses what we call the scientific method. And that is the use of observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment to discover patterns of recurring behavior in the present physical universe. So, you want to know what is the cause of AIDS. So you study the HIV virus in the laboratory, and you control the environment, you control the variables to isolate just one variable, and you do an experiment to test your hypothesis. And you're looking for how things repeat themselves so that you can figure out how to destroy this virus. As I said, that's often called experimental science, and that's where we get our technologies. But origin science is very different. Fields of origin science include historical geology, paleontology, archaeology. You could even call criminal investigation a form of origin science. You want to know who done it or what done it in the past. And so it uses the legal historical method, which can be defined this way. The use of reliable eyewitness testimony, if any is available, and circumstantial evidence to determine the cause or causes of some past, unobservable, singular event which has left evidence in the present. So, my son is a sheriff's deputy down in Florida. He comes to a house and there's a dead body on the floor. He wants to know, how did that body get dead? Was it murder? Was it suicide? Was it accidental death? And so he has to study the circumstantial evidence. Is there a gun on the floor? Is there a hole in the head? Is there a pool of blood on the floor? And then he wants to look for any eyewitnesses to solve the case. I was just in the Grand Canyon with Dr. Andrew Snelling last week. That's a big hole in the ground, 4 to 18 miles wide, 277 miles long, and a mile deep. How'd it get there? Nobody was there to observe it, so I got to study this circumstantial evidence. The rock layers, the fossils, characteristics of the rock layers, to try to reconstruct the unobserved past. Completely different. You can't recreate the Grand Canyon in the lab. You can't recreate the dead body in the laboratory. You can't raise him up and then kill him again and see if that was the way it happened. So this is historical science, and a lot of people look at the success of operation science and say, well, look at all the technology. This is proof that science works. And therefore, what the origin scientists are telling us about the history of the world and the age of the earth, that must be true too, because we have space shuttles and refrigerators. It's a complete confusion of categories. And so we say, well, the Bible's not a science textbook, but it is the history book of the universe. It tells us how this world came into existence and what's happened to it and what will happen to it in the future. So you have these various compromise views, and let's just look at a few objections that flow out of these views. One is the gap theory. And people will say, okay, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That was way back in the past, 14 billion years ago. And the formation of stars and the rock layers with all those fossils in them, all that death, that happened before verse 2. And then the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And then you have 6 literal days of recreation. That's not a good way of looking at the text for a lot of reasons, but one is we get back to the Hebrew verb again. You remember I talked about the fact that in verse 1 we have a verb in the perfect verb form, and then in verse 3 we have the vav consecutive. The Hebrew conjunction vav, which can be translated as and or then or now, depending on the context, and running through. But verse 2 begins a different way. It does not begin with the vav connected to the imperfect verb. It begins with vav attached to the noun, the earth. So it's a very different construction, and Hebrew scholars call this a vav disjunctive rather than a vav consecutive. And it means that verse 2 is a little parenthetical statement saying something about what the earth was like when God first created it. The narrative of events goes from verse 1 to verse 3. Verse 2 is not part of the narrative of events, it's just describing what the earth was like. There's no gap of millions of years in between those verse 1 and 3. And the greatest defense or refutation of the gap theory is the book Unformed and Unfilled, written about 3 decades ago, but still an excellent refutation of that point by an Old Testament scholar. The days of Genesis 1, Ken talked about this last night, so I'm just going to briefly remind you that the Hebrew word for day, yom, is defined the very first time it's used in the Old Testament. It's defined literally in verse 5 as the light portion of the light-dark cycle and the whole light-dark cycle. It's modified by numerical adjectives: first day, or 1 day, second day, third day, fourth day. And everywhere in the Old Testament where yom is modified by a number, it always means a literal day. The context makes that perfectly clear. It's also used with evening and morning. And everywhere those Hebrew words, evening and morning, are used, either together or separately, with yom in the context or not, the context shows they're clearly literal evenings and literal mornings of literal days. And then yom is defined again in verse 14 when God created the sun, moon, and stars. You see, Adam and Eve were not created with a wristwatch or a calendar. So how are they going to tell time? Well, verse 14 says that they were to tell time, they were to measure years and seasons and days by the movement of the heavenly bodies. And those are literal years and literal seasons and literal days. But there's another fact here that I have found a lot of even scholars who argue that we can accept the millions of years, they ignore the order of events in Genesis 1. In fact, on this Grand Canyon trip, we took 24 seminary and Christian college professors and a few key Christian leaders in other fields on a 7-day raft trip down the Colorado River. One of those, 8 of them were actually old Earth in their view, or unsure what they thought about the age of the Earth. And the reason we invited them to come and paid about, through scholarships, about 90% of the cost of the trip for them, was to get them down into the canyon so they could see for themselves that what the scientific establishment has been telling them about millions of years is false. But one of those guys was a young Earth creationist. He was really excited to come on the trip, and I was talking to him on the 5th day and found out that he's a theologian and a philosopher, that he had been using the Big Bang to argue in class for the existence of God, even though he considered himself a young Earth creationist. And so I very gently pointed out to him what I'm going to show you now. And he had not thought about this before. You see, in the Big Bang view, the first event is the Big Bang. The original, very, very dense kernel of mass energy and space exploded and began to spread out. And after a few billion years, the first stars formed as gas clouds of helium and hydrogen collapsed, and we had the first stars. And then billions of years later, our sun was formed. It's one of the younger stars in the universe, according to the evolutionists. It was a hot, molten ball of gases, and it had a gas cloud around it, and those gas clouds eventually evolved into planets, and our Earth was born about 4.5 billion years ago, and it was initially a hot, molten lava ball. It cooled and developed a crust, and it evolved an atmosphere, which then brought rain and filled the low spots on the crust. So about 3.8 billion years ago, we had our first oceans. In the evolutionary view, the sun came before the earth, and there was dry land before there was any water. But the Bible tells a very different story, a really history. God created the earth, and that was the first thing he made, before he even made light. And the earth was completely covered with water. The Bible says the earth has been completely covered with water twice, the first 2 days of creation and Noah's flood. The evolutionary geologists tell us this earth has never, ever been completely covered with water. That's a massive contradiction. And then God created the dry land on day 3, and he created all of the plants. Then on day 4, he created the sun, moon, and stars. So in the Bible, grapes have been in existence longer than galaxies. And peanuts have been in existence longer than planets. And carrots have been in existence longer than comets. But that totally contradicts what the evolutionists say. And then on day 5, we have the sea creatures and the birds. And day 6, we have the land animals. When we look at the biology, there's even more contradictions. In the evolutionary view, life began in the oceans. The first creatures were sea creatures. And then millions of years after that, land plants evolved. Millions of years after that, the first dinosaurs evolved. And then millions of years after the first dinosaurs, the birds evolved. And most evolutionists believe that dinosaurs evolved into birds. And then millions of years after the first dinosaurs, the higher mammals evolved. But the Bible says something very different. The land plants were created before the sun, moon, and stars, and before the fish. And the fish and the birds were created on the same day. Which means that the birds were created before the dinosaurs, because the dinosaurs were made on day 6, because they're land animals. So you cannot harmonize the Bible with the evolutionary order of events unless you do violence to the biblical text and move things around. But that's not Bible study. That's Bible mutilation. And then there's another thing. The future is different. In the evolutionary view, the future is going to be a heat death, which means that all of the heat will be spent and the universe will just be, if it goes on as long as they imagine, it'll just be dead. All the stars will burn all their energy. It'll just be a frozen wasteland. But the Bible says there's going to be a heat destruction by literal heat, and then a new heavens and a new earth. And it's interesting to me that many people who accept the Big Bang and reject what the Bible says about the past of the universe believe what the Bible says about the future of the universe. Now, why is that? Because what the Bible says about the future of the universe is very difficult to interpret prophecies, which have a lot of non-literal language in them. Why do they take that literally and they don't take this literally? It's inconsistent. Exodus 20 verse 11 says, in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. That rules out the day-age view because God said in 6 days. It also rules out the gap theory because it says in 6 days God made what? The heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that was in them. He didn't make anything before the 6 days. But then one of my former professors says, well, Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11 is just emphasizing the pattern of 6 and 1. Now, if God were just emphasizing 6 and 1, that 11th verse would say something different. Because there are other Hebrew words that God could have used other than the word yom in verse 11. He said, you children of Israel work 6 days, yom, yamim in plural, because I created it in 6 days, yamim, same word. If God wanted to say, you work 6 days and rest on the 7th because I created over 6 long periods and rested on the 7th, there were lots of ways in the Hebrew language he could have said that. He didn't. He chose the only Hebrew word that means a literal day. And that's what he used. Well, there's another objection. Yeah, but Genesis 1 is written as a polemic against the pagan ancient Near Eastern creation myths. A polemic is an argument that you write intentionally to refute some other argument. That's a very common view among scholars, because as we look at the elements of the narrative in Genesis 1, they clearly are different from the elements of the narratives of the ancient Babylonian creation myth, the ancient Assyrian, the ancient Egyptian. There you find polytheism. In Genesis 1, you have one God. And there you have evil matter, and in Genesis 1, everything is very good. And so there's lots of differences there. But it wasn't written as a polemic. There's several reasons I think that. First of all, truth by its very nature is always a polemic against what is false. If I say 2 plus 2 is 4, that is a polemic against the statement 2 plus 2 equals 5. But I didn't write the equation 2 plus 2 is 4 to refute the idea that 2 plus 2 is 5. I'm just stating the facts. And always, A statement of truth is, by its very nature, a polemic against what is false. Then we have the Toledotes, which I mentioned. These are the generations of. They strongly indicate the content of Genesis 1 to 11 existed before any of the ancient Near Eastern stories were written. What's really popular today in Old Testament studies is to, and even among evangelicals, is to view the ancient Near Eastern creation myths as older than Genesis. And of course, they were written before Moses. But they make the false assumption that because Moses put it in its final form, the information didn't exist before. Where did those ancient Near Eastern cultures get the idea of a creation and get the idea of a flood? They're all descended from people who came off the ark and from the Tower of Babel. That's why they're similar. Why are they corrupted? Because they didn't have the truly preserved record that God preserved through the patriarchs, and so they started to mythologize in the years as they were telling the stories and as they became spiritually corrupted. So the Genesis account is giving us the true account. The ancient Near Eastern stories that are sort of like Genesis are actually, if we're really thinking biblically about this, they are satanically twisted versions of the truth to confuse people. Also, there's no evidence in Genesis 1 that it was written for the conscious purpose of being a polemic. You look at Galatians 1, and Paul is clearly writing against false gospels. You look at Romans 2, and Paul is clearly writing against people who think that they are morally good, or against the Jews who think they don't need Christ. And you look at 1 John, and John is clearly writing against those who would deny the humanity of Christ or the deity of Christ. But there's no indication in Genesis 1 that Moses was writing to refute those ancient Near Eastern myths. And then Moses had no motivation to give the Jews a polemic. Since they were not involved in evangelism, and they were told to destroy and not associate with the pagan nations around them. Also, they were leaving Egypt for good, so they didn't need a polemic against the Egyptian view. And they weren't going to be entering Babylon and Assyria until many, many years later when God judged them for their rebellion. So they didn't need a polemic. They needed the truth about where they came from and why the world was the way it was. Well, there's various objections to the literal days, and I'll just breeze through these. You can't have literal days before the sun. I'm amazed that Christians say this, even Christian scholars. That is really reasoning like an atheist. God doesn't need the sun to create the phenomenon of light. He created the light on day one. He blinded Saul on the road to Damascus in the middle of the day. He didn't blind him with the sun. He blinded him with another source of light. In the new heavens and the new earth, there won't be any night, but there won't be any sun. God is not dependent on light. He created the light in verse 3. And you say, well, what was that light? I have no idea. Well, why didn't God tell us what that light was? If God told us everything He knows, the Bible would be infinitely long. So I just look at what God tells me. I don't worry about what He didn't tell me. And He clearly, plainly says He created light on verse 1. And so then I remember Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children. So that's what I worry about, what God has revealed. Yom is used in a non-literal sense in the context. Right in Genesis 2:4, it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heaven.